ready to go.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar entitled Unpacking California's Inside and Outside Sales Exemptions, presented by Ethos Human Capital Solutions and Merhab Robinson and Clarkson Law Corporation. My name is Denise Keddy, and I'm your moderator for this session, and I just wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. The webinar will run anywhere between 45 and 60 minutes. We try to leave some time for some Q&A at the conclusion of the webinar. If you need to leave the webinar, don't worry, we are recording this, and both Ethos and Merhab Robinson will post them on their each individual YouTube channels. During the presentation, and once I finish this intro, I will add a link to the slide presentation in the chat area for you to download. Or you can get the link right now to download. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A area on the dashboard at any time during the presentation. If you'd like your question to be directed to a specific panelist, please note that when you're putting your question in. If you have issues during the presentation, please put a note in the webinar chat. I monitor the chat for the entire time. Just a quick reminder about today. Today's webinar is being recorded and all the accompanying materials are protected by copyright. Our presentation is intended for information purposes only and should not be relied on in reaching a conclusion in any area of law. The information we are offering is good as of today, November 14th, 2024. As always, we recommend that you consult your own legal counsel to address specific situations. And ensure that you have the most up-to-date information on your legal matters. Our webinar today has been approved for HRCI credit. If you want credit for your attendance, you'll have to complete the follow-up survey. I will also add that link throughout the session into the chat area, so make sure that you download it, answer the session so that you do get your certificate and your credit. Let me start by introducing our expert presenters. Our legal expert is Luna Hernandez. She is an associate attorney at the law firm of Merhab Robinson and Clarkson in the firm's transactional department, where she advises clients in real estate, finance, M&A, and employment law. She is just back from her leave, so we're happy to be back in the saddle again to do the webinars. Luna loves the law so much that when she studied in her native South Africa, she worked as a paralegal, and after she came to the U.S., she continued her studies at USC and was admitted to the state bar over a year ago. In her spare time, you can find Luna cycling, running, or trying new restaurants throughout Orange County.
Not now because she has a
Not
newborn.
now.
Oh, that's true. That's true. She's a little busy now, so she just had a baby. Our next presenter is Linda Duffy. She is the president of Ethos Human Capital Solutions, and she has over 30 years of experience building her business and her team to deliver outstanding consulting, recruiting, training, payroll support, and organizational programs. Linda and her team are known for bringing the magic of the human connection to all the companies that they work for by developing strategies for business leaders to get the right systems, people, and culture in place within your organization so that you, as a business owner, can focus on running your business and achieving your goals. In Linda's spare time, you can still find her cheering the beloved Angels, even though we all know it was a tough season. So I know she's flipping to hockey right now. So go Ducks.
Full on go Ducks mode. So
okay, so can you get us started this morning?
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate everybody being here. Thanks, Denise and Luna, of course, for being my partners in crime on this. So this is a really sort of technical discussion we're doing today, so bear with us. What we're really going to be looking at is what the rules are for making somebody exempt from overtime under the inside and outside sales exemptions, which are very different than what's normally referred to as the white collar exemptions. We're going to talk about the IWC orders. Some people don't remember what those are, so I'm going to talk about those. Also, just give you some ideas on some best practices and some of the issues that we run into and that we see a lot with companies. So let's get started by first talking about like where the laws come from that are governing it. I can't even say that word, governing these particular issues. So first and foremost, we have at the federal level, we have the Fair Labor Standards Act. So most companies are familiar with that, although in a lot of instances, California law is at such a higher standard that we don't really even run into the FLSA much. But today, for today's conversation, it's going to be critical in a couple of distinct areas. So we're going to address that. And then in California, a lot of people don't remember that we have these Industrial Welfare Commission wage orders, IWC orders. The commission was disbanded many years ago, but I took a screenshot, a little screenshot of just the front page for the one that we're really going to be focused on today. And just as a reminder, when you have your posters up throughout the company, you also, if you buy them from Cal Chamber or someplace else and you get those big laminated posters, you still have to post the relevant IWC order. So just keep that in mind. But this is where a lot of wage and hour information, alternative work week information, things like that resides. So we always just say, oh, it's the labor code, but it actually is on this printed handout if you take a look at it. Okay, so let's jump right in. I have the pleasure of talking about the inside sales, and then Luna is going to talk about the outside sales and some of the penalties involved. So on inside sales under California law, an inside sales employee may be exempt from state overtime requirements if they meet this criteria. And you can see that the criteria is very different from the white collar exemptions. So the white collar exemptions, meaning where we're talking about executive, professional, administrative exemptions, you'll remember that the rule is twice minimum wage. Well, for inside sales, it's not twice minimum wage, it's 1.5 times minimum wage, and it's measured every work week of that pay period. So right now, that would be $24 an hour because it's $16 an hour for minimum wage across the board, and then 1.5 times that would be $24 an hour. So this requirement has to be met every pay period. And you can't just take commissions and throw them on in to make up the difference necessarily from different pay periods. So that's the one thing. But the second prong of this is that more than half of the employee's compensation has to come from commissions. So you're paying $24 an hour, but you're also making sure that they have more than half of their compensation derived from commissions. It has to be met every work week, and that's where the rub is, because how many companies, because we don't run across a lot of these, how many companies actually pay commissions more than once a month? Most are paying at the end of the month, which means you're never going to be compliant with this requirement. The third requirement is the employee has to work in either what's called the mercantile industry, which is covered by wage order 7, or in a professional, technical, clerical, or mechanical occupation, which is covered by wage order 4. And I'm going to say you're going to just put a pin in that one for a second because we're going to dive down a little bit deeper. Okay, so those are the main requirements for the inside sales position. Let's go on to the next page. If we look at the federal rules, you'll notice that some of them are similar, right? So the employee earns more than 1.5 times the federal minimum wage. Now, of course, in California, our minimum wage is much higher, right? More than 2 times higher than the federal one. So you have to go by the state one. And you can take the total earnings attributed in the pay period, divide by the hours to make sure it's meeting that threshold. The second criterion is that they have to derive at least 50% of their income from commissions, right? So the same thing, they have slightly different ways of calculating it and when you can pull in, different pay periods and such, but it has to be 50%, more than 50% in the form of commission. And then this is the higher standard, which is they have to work in a retail and service industry. And so there's a definition of what that constitutes. So I'm going to look down for a second because I'm looking at my notes here. So at these standards, number 3 is actually the higher standard, right? We have wage orders 7 and 4. 7 is mercantile, so most likely that's going to be covered here. But wage order 4 may not be, falling into this category of retail and service industry. So that's why you have to take a look at it. But let's look at that definition of the FLSA. So it says it's broadly defined to include companies that sell goods or provide services directly to the general public, typically for personal, household, or non-commercial use, right? So these establishments are characterized by regular dealings with the general public as opposed to other businesses. So that even makes it more narrow, right? So you go from, okay, they're in, retail and service, but now we're really talking about business to consumer more than business to business. So the examples they give that would qualify under this are things like grocery stores, restaurants, hotels, so your hospitality industry, car dealership, clothing stores, even beauty salons and dry cleaners. But they say the industries that do not qualify are like manufacturing companies, wholesalers, construction firms, things like that. Even my own business, I was talking about this with Luna yesterday, even my own business, right? We sell to other businesses. It would not qualify under the retail and service industry, meaning we would never be able to have somebody exempt from the overtime laws as a result of that. If we go back to the California standard again, 4 and 7, it's easy to see right away if you're in manufacturing, you're never going to be able to have an inside sales rep exempt because it's not going to fall under the correct IWC orders. So I hope that makes sense because I know it's a little bit confusing. And that's why I said this is really technical and why we're going to go through it. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions because we know we're going to have them. So since we always have to play by the standard that provides the highest benefit to the employee, the highest standard for California becomes this, right? 150% of minimum wage, right? So at least $24 an hour. And more than 50% of the employee's compensation has to come in the form of commissions. And they have to work in a retail and service industry. So most likely, again, IWC Order 7 is going to be the same as that or very similar. But if you're under IWC Order 4, you're going to have to get some sort of analysis done to see if it qualifies. And if you're in any other IWC order, you're never going to be able to be compliant and have a salary exempt inside salesperson. So let's just take a look at a couple of examples here. So the first one, we know what the rules are, right? So let's say an employee is making 1.5 times minimum wage. You're just going to straight up pay them 24 bucks an hour, right? Whether that's a salary or hourly. The employee must earn a minimum of $960 in base pay, right? So that's 1.5 times at 40 hours. And then you're paying them $961 in commission. So that means every week they're essentially earning over $1,900 per week. Okay, that's a simple straight up example. Now, here's another one that we see every once in a while. Employees getting paid $50,000 base, right? It doesn't have to be at that white collar exemption, excuse me, which is, 66,000 or whatever. It doesn't have to be in that. And they'll write a plan that says, oh, and the employee can make up to $50,001 in commissions, right? It's when I see that phrase up to that concerns me because you would need to look at their pay on a weekly basis to determine whether they qualify for the exemption. And we're going to talk about how that plays out in just a minute. Here's another example. The employee is getting paid 50,000 base, which we know is right at that, twice or 1.5 times minimum wage. So that's part's okay. And they make $961 in bonuses each week. And bonuses are not viewed the same as commission. So under the California law, incentive-based comp has to be roughly proportional to their sales activity, right? So if it's a fixed bonus, it's probably going to disqualify you because it has to be tied to their sales productivity. And if it's not, they're not going to view that as commission or incentive under this rule. Okay, so here's the other thing we see a lot that is like the fine print, right? That people don't realize. So the white collar exemptions, if you qualify as an executive or under the administrative or professional exemption, exempts you from all sorts of things, right? You don't have to, have uninterrupted breaks and meal periods. You don't have to clock in and out. You have to do all these different things. Even the inside sales folks, though, that are considered exempt under this particular exemption, the only thing they're being exempted from is the overtime. So let me explain that. So IWC Order 7, just like all the IWC orders, they lay out all of these different rules, having to do with wage and hour. So Section 3 has hours and days of work in every single one, right? And it goes through 3A, talks about daily overtime, right? 3B is that alternative work week section if somebody wants to put in 4 10-hour days or a 980 work week. The third one are the election procedures that go along with that. So for IWC Order 7 and in 4, there is a section 3D that says provisions of subsections ABC above shall not apply to any employee whose earnings exceed 1.5 times minimum wage, right? It goes on from there. But that means that employees still have to record their time. They have to clock, in to start their day, out for lunch, back in, out at the end of the day. You still have to have those time records. They still have to take a meal period before the end of their 5th hour. They still are entitled to 2 rest periods. So the only thing, even if an inside salesperson qualifies as exempt, the only thing that they're exempted from is the overtime provisions, not the rest of the requirements in the IWC order. So at this point, honestly, you have to start to ask yourself, is this even worth it? Because to us, it's not. This is really complex. The calculations are difficult. Even this week, as we were preparing for this, I was reaching out to multiple people to sanity check me on this because the devil's in the details on this one. And it's really important because the consequences of noncompliance are pretty serious. And with that, I happily turn it over to Luna so she can start talking about that and then also what happens on the outside sales side.
Lovely. Thanks, Linda. I have the fun job over here and certainly the easier one with the outside sales exemption where I don't have to do any math. So thank you for that. Okay, so the consequences of non-compliance. Firstly, you are going to have to pay overtime for any week where commissions were less than 50% of the total earnings. Now, there's obviously a large administrative burden here because you're going to have to do those calculations every week. And we also need to work out the employees' overtime based on the regular rate of pay, not the base rate. If you do not pay them overtime for the weeks that they have earned it, you are going to be exposed to potential PAGA claims as well as Labor Commissioner unpaid wage claims. And then, of course, because you have not paid all wages on time, you're going to be exposed to waiting time penalties. I'd like to drill down a little more on this huge administrative burden. There's also a large room for error here. You're really going to need to trust the person who's making these calculations. And obviously, if they're making them in error, that is imputed to the company. Not a direct consequence of the inside sales exemption, but we do like to always remind employers to please ensure that your employees are taking their meal and rest periods. We do advise clocking out for meal breaks, an uninterrupted 30-minute meal period that can be unpaid, and we do not advise clocking out for the 2 10-minute rest periods. And then there are, of course, also penalties for misclassification of the employee. So now that I've told you about the penalties, let's look at the outside sales exemption, which is a lot easier here. So under the FLSA, so the federal requirement, to qualify for an outside sales exemption, the employee's primary duty involves sales or obtaining orders or contracts, and the employee must customarily and regularly work away from the employer's premises. Now, under the California standard, it goes a step further and it says that the employee is primarily engaged in sales, and then it actually sets a 50% threshold. It says the employee spends more than 50% of working time away from the employer's place of business. So under the federal standard, primary duty means that the principal, main, major, or most important duty that the employee performs. And under California law, primarily engaged in sales means that the employee's main duty is to perform sales. Now, just on a side note here, what the courts have said is that you cannot count the non-exempt sort of tangential work that employees conduct while they're on their sales routes towards this primarily engaged standard. So you need to ensure that when you are doing this calculation to see is 50% of the time spent away from the employer's pace of business, that it is solely focused on those activities where one is customarily engaged in sales. Under the federal standard, the phrase customarily and regularly means greater than occasional, but less than constant. It includes work normally done every work week, but does not include isolated or one-time tasks. And in California, the main difference here is that California requires the outside salesperson to work away from the place of business for more than 50% of the time, as we've discussed. So this includes working away from a home office, not just the company's location. So if you thought that you were going to circumvent this somehow by saying, oh, well, a home office is not the employer's place of business, you would unfortunately not meet that standard. And the California standard is obviously a higher standard than the federal rule. So under all of the wage orders, it states that the provisions of the order shall not apply to outside salespersons. So when we discussed the inside salespeople, we said that the exemption is only applicable to overtime. However, when it comes to the outside salespeople, none of the wage order applies, and that includes both overtime, as we see with inside sales, as well as minimum wage, meal and rest periods, etc. The definition of the wage order says that an outside salesperson means any person who is 18 years of age and over, so this cannot apply to anyone under that, who customarily and regularly, we've just gone and defined that, works in more than half the working time away from the employer's place of business, selling tangible or intangible items or obtaining orders or contracts for products, services, or use of facilities. So this means if you have someone who qualifies under this outside salesperson exemption, they do not need to clock in and out. They do not need to have meal or rest breaks, and they are not entitled to minimum wage or overtime. So you can pay an outside salesperson 100% commission only and be compliant with both federal and state law. As you can see, a much easier standard to meet than the inside salesperson exemption. Looking at some practical examples over here, a compliant outside salesperson in this case would be if Joe's primary duty is to conduct outside sales efforts. If he spends 2 or more hours each morning making calls and then he visits customers for the remainder of the day, he is 100% commission based on sales made. And then non-compliant, we'll see Joe's primary duty is to conduct outside sales efforts, and he works from home 4 days per week and only 1 day in the office. He is 100% commission-based and sales made. So just drilling down on those, in the compliant example, Joe works 25% of the time making calls and 75% of the time is out in the field meeting with customers. So you'll see that meets the over 50% threshold. However, in the non-compliant version, just because he works from home, it doesn't mean that he qualifies as working away from the employer's place of business. So you'll see that falls underneath the 50% required, and as such would not qualify for the outside salesperson exemption. So we've told you a lot now. The best place to start if you are considering an inside salesperson exemption is you first have to conduct the first step of the analysis. And that is, does your company qualify under the wage order 7 and the federal requirement? So under 7 and then is engaged in retail or sales, as Linda had discussed. If it meets that, and only then do you continue on to look at the compensation structure and ensure that the 1.5 times minimum California minimum wage and the over 50% commission structure is met every work week. And then with regards to outside sales, you start your analysis by saying, is the employee engaged primarily in sales? And if yes, you can look at the percent of time spent working away from the office. If it is over 50%, then you are likely to be compliant. And if not, then obviously you would not be. That concludes really discussing the inside and outside salesperson's exemptions, but we did want to just remind everyone that under the labor code, a commission agreement is required if you are entering into these sorts of scenarios with your employee. So the agreement must spell out the way that the commissions will be calculated and paid. And it is also very important when writing the commission agreement that you are clear about when commissions are earned. For example, is a commission earned when the customer signs a sales agreement? Is it when the product is shipped, when the product is delivered, or when the payment is made? Is there a period that you allow for returns? And this is all necessary because it will affect when payment, what type of payment is made, and what is due on termination. Lastly, the agreement, it does need to be signed by both parties, and you also need to furnish the employee with a copy of this commission agreement. So, best practices. Both Linda and I agree, do not have inside salespeople in California. It's just far too complicated, and you just open yourself up to unnecessary liability. I had also said yesterday, the time it's going to take you to calculate each of these salespeople and whether they've met, is it worthwhile when you can just pay them that amount of overtime? So food for
Luna,
thought.
I should have put on that slide, you can have inside salespeople. That should really say don't have exempt inside salespeople.
Right. Use compliance checklists for inside and outside sales roles. And then always implement regular audits and seek counsel from either Ethos or our firm if you have any questions. I'm going to hand it over to Linda.
Well, I'm going to hand it over to everybody and also to Denise to say, what questions can we try to answer for you? Emphasis on try there, but.
Yeah. So you just really went into this, but can I have a part-time inside salesperson who is salary exempt?
You can potentially have a part-time salesperson. Like we get this question a lot on the white collar exemptions, right? Well, that person only works 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week. It doesn't change the requirements though, right? You still have the minimum of 1.5 times minimum wage, and that more than half of their compensation has to be in the form of commissions. So you could have a part-time person, but it's not going to allow you to prorate that, so to speak.
Okay, so let's say, since we have to look at everything on a weekly basis, if you're willing to pay overtime for a few weeks that an employee doesn't earn enough commission, when we're talking about commissions, can we do that?
Yes. Now, so that's what we're talking about. The administrative burden on this gets really complex.
Yeah.
And the good news, bad news is, and most people want to be exempt because they don't want they don't want the burden of having to clock in and out and do all the different things and take their lunch at a certain time. And we get that. But the good news is that if you do have those records and you are, hoping that somebody makes that, 50+% threshold on their incentive pay, that you could then keep them exempt. But the good news is you have the records, right? If you're having them clock in and out and do everything else, and there's a week for some reason they don't make commission. It could be as simple as they're on vacation, right? It could be a lot of reasons they don't hit the commission number. Then for that particular week, you would pay them hourly as non-exempt, which means they would be entitled to overtime.
Still a lot of calculation.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah.
Definitely, it's a lot.
And a lot to get tripped up on, I think. Okay.
Sure.
So do we need to follow California laws for remote salespeople who work from their homes in other states and conduct business by phone and email. So they said their assumption is the remote salesperson would be considered inside sales, an inside salesperson, because they work from their home office, not primarily the field. So we're talking about out of state.
Yeah, federal rules are different, right? So they're similar on the inside sales. If I'm assuming inside sales, right? If they're just making phone calls, they're
Yeah.
similar. They still have the, 1.5 times and the more than 50%, things like that. But it's, 1.5 times the federal minimum wage if they're out of state, not California, right? So I think that's like $7.50 an hour or whatever. So that rule is going to be definitely easier to maintain. But yes, you're going to want to look at the FLSA rules around inside salespeople. And then you just have to look at their state, whatever they're in, to see if there's any other rule for them. And, not knowing each state off the top of my head, I can't answer that question more specifically. Lynn, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I would just want to add that if they were, in fact, a California employee, though, even though that they were working in other states, they would have to meet the California standard then.
Right, but if their payroll taxes, they're registered in Ohio, let's say, and they're working out of Ohio, they would go by those rules, right? So
I would imagine so, but I would have to check that and make sure that we had all the facts there.
Okay. We have a question from somebody who's in the construction industry and they employ an estimator. He's responsible for project estimates and sales, works in an office. Salary meets the inside sales rules for California. However, commission is not part of their salary structure. He is paid a bonus on a yearly sales. He is currently categorized as an exempt employee and his salary is over 110 annually. Is that correct? Is he correct?
maybe.
I know. That's why these questions are going to be for everybody. We can answer certain things, but
Yeah.
I think more direct have to come direct to you guys.
Yeah, I'll share my thoughts, my hallucinations about it, and then Lena can jump in with hers, right? Most likely, my guess is for that type of role, because we've had construction clients, right? That type of role probably, quote unquote, probably qualifies under the administrative exemption, right? That would be my guess. It's not I mean, even though there's a component of sales to it, that's not their primary role. It's not selling, right? It's like making the quote for somebody else. That would be how I would look at it. The other possibility, if their primary duty is sales, right? They could be an outside salesperson. And then again, it doesn't really matter, but we'd have to look at those facts. But my guess is as long as they're making twice the minimum wage under the white collar exemption, they're probably going to qualify under the admin. Luna?
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that part. And then I would say that you said in the construction industry, but I'm thinking about in the outside salesperson definition, it's selling tangible or intangible products or services. I did say services, correct?
Yes.
So we would also need to look at that to see if that would be a way around it. But with that 110, it appears from the limited information that we have is they may qualify under the administrative exemption.
Okay. If an outside and assigned, okay, I'm assuming a salesperson. If an outside salesperson is assigned to a primary sales office, is time spent outside the primary sales office, including calling from home, considered outside time? This is all crazy.
I would probably say no. If just because they're at home calling from home, that doesn't mean that they're not, under the employer's umbrella and direction and control. So again, you would need to look at is 50% or more of the time spent out in the field doing sales. If yes, then it likely would be a exempt outside salesperson employee. But if no, then you wouldn't qualify for that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Denise. I was talking to Luna and I was telling her that I once heard a very well-known, I think now retired plaintiff's counsel in Orange County. He had like a job shop, right? He would just put people through all the time for whatever claims against employers. And I heard him speak one time, and he even said, look, I could make an argument that someone's car is an office because they have access to their phone and their computer and their everything else. So he was like, he was willing to go that far to make an argument that that doesn't even qualify. And what his point was is that the reason that this was developed was to get people out in front of customers, like meeting face to face, right? So that's what they're talking about when they're doing that 50% measurement is like, are you meeting with customers face to face and not over the phone?
Yeah, because there's another question here about, funny you bring that up, but are there loopholes around the away from employer's place of business in the age of Zoom meetings? So
yeah, again, you've got to be out in the field with customers is the point of this, right? So meeting face to face with Zoom is an inside sales function. It's not an outside sales function. So yeah, you've got to be, again, really diligent at looking at the details on this to see like what qualifies and what falls under which definitions. And are you looking at it under the federal law or the state law?
and people are wondering about if outside sales is exempt and from nearly all tracking, how do you know if more than half their time is really working in the field? I think that's an inside problem.
Well, no, it's an outside problem and potentially an inside problem too, but an outside problem because I get what they're saying. They still, you could still require the outside salespeople to keep records, right? In theory, they're reporting in some way what their activities are, right? You're not just like, hey, I'll just send you a paycheck every week or two and be done with that, right? So, they're going to have the burden will be on the employer if an employer ever comes back and challenges and says, hey, I wasn't really truly meeting the definition or the, requirements of outside sales. So hopefully you're doing some sort of reporting.
Yeah, and also just jumping in there, just because you are not required to have them clock in and out by law, it doesn't mean that it won't be best practice to have some sort of tracking mechanism of how many hours they're working for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think those are the more general questions that we've had. I know we have had some specific questions, which again, we're going to recommend you contact Linda or Luna. Their information is in the deck. If you haven't downloaded the deck, I'll put it one more time into the chat so that you have it. And then if you want to close us out, Linda.
Yeah, I just saw one other question that was posted in these that was talking, I think, about that estimator because it says, I would agree with the administrative section. The only requirement that he does not meet is that he does not manage any other employees. Kathleen, that's not a requirement under the administrative section. That's a requirement under the executive section that they spend more than 50% of their time managing two or more, the equivalent of two or more full-time employees. So don't worry about that. If that's the only thing they're not meeting, they're good, right? And then someone else just asked about link to the YouTube channels. So I don't know if you know yours, Luna. Mine is simply youtube.com and then /ethos HCS, just like the end of my email address. So I'll move that to the next page. So anyway, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Luna, and we will try to do our best to answer them. They are so fact specific, sometimes that it takes a little bit of digging down. But I do appreciate everybody's time and attendance today and, being fully engaged in this. It is a complex situation, especially on those inside sales reps. Our next webinar is going to be our annual New Laws for the New Year webinar. This one, of course, for 2025. We have a handle, I think, on most of them at this point, but we're still, going through and making sure that we're up to speed. So December 12th at 11 a.m., I put the link there, the shortened version to register, and Denise will be getting that out to everybody soon as well. So thanks once again for attending and look forward to seeing you next month.
Have a great day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.